In March 2020, we were all wondering how COVID would change us. Would it be a temporary shock? Would it reshape society forever? Well, now, virtually 6 years on, the data's in, and it turns out the pandemic didn't rewrite Australia's destiny, but it did press fast forward on changes that were already underway. Hi, I'm Michael Yardney, and in today's episode of Demographics Decoded, I'm joined by my co-host, leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher, who's been diving deep into the numbers, what's been happening since then. So we're going to unpack how COVID accelerated future demographic shifts, from fewer babies and more deaths to the rise in millennials and the gradual handover of economic power from the boomers. We're also going to look at what all this means for skill shortages, inflation, interest rates, and Australia's future prosperity. So whether you're an investor, a business owner, or just curious about how COVID is still shaping our lives, stick around. We're going to be going through all that. So, Simon, you wrote about this recently. You said the pandemic didn't change our demographic destiny. It just pressed fast forward.
Yeah, there were quite a few things that were absolutely sped up, a couple of developments by the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic did have real impacts. We all remember how the pandemic was. And it's a weird mix of the pandemic having faded into the background quite quickly, and that every now and then we look back and go, whoa, can you remember what happened during COVID and how crazy that actually was? And at the same time, it is still present in some data sets. So yeah, and of course, in many a data set, you will always see the COVID impact. Even in 50 years, when we look back, there will be spikes up, spikes down, and depending what the data set is. That is something that had a severe, lasting impact on Australia.
Well, we like to discuss the demographic trends, I can't even say it, that are going to shape our future. So I think it's important to understand what it's done in the past and what's going to happen ahead. I guess different people also have been affected differently. Those who were going through school weren't able to go for a couple of years. Those in Victoria were more locked down than other states. Baby boomers felt some of their free time. Overseas trips were taken away. We all had a different effect from COVID.
Absolutely. And I want to give a particular shout out here to the kids that were in their early teenage years to maybe early 20s during the pandemic, because these were the cohort that were in the formative years during the pandemic. And so while you and I and everyone we know was definitely impacted by COVID, and we weren't shaped by it. It is this young cohort that lived through the pandemic in their formative years. And it doesn't mean that they will be scarred for life or anything, but they were impacted the most, and the pandemic will have the biggest impact on them. Taken aside, of course, people who died from the virus, they were impacted in a very
Yes,
severe way. But
clearly.
from a long-lasting perspective, it's actually the young people that I'm looking out for the most here.
Well, let's start broad. Let's look at the data, because you've dug into that in an article you wrote in the New Daily. What does the data actually say about how Australia has changed since 2020?
Yeah, so in that time, since we added almost 1 million people, about 900,000 people or thereabouts, of course, depends on when exactly you make those cut-off lines. But overall, we just know that the country became bigger. We saw straight after the pandemic was introduced, if you will, in March 2020, we saw migration dip to record lows. At some point, we even recorded net negative migration, essentially the first time since Federation. And then there was a big surge after the borders were open, where at some point, statistically speaking, we saw record high migration intake. In net terms, this was twice as high as the previous record. But that was, of course, playing catch up, because we didn't allow people in for quite a while. And so then you take in so many people in one hit, that creates a big surge. And now we stabilize, reversion to the mean, this kind of stuff. So we're now pretty much at pre-pandemic migration levels. Births did slow. It was, of course, all fun during the early
That's
lockdowns
not
to
what
say,
people predicted, was it, Simon?
no, because I think this all has to do with an old myth about some sort of power outage in New York in the 70s, where the power was out for 3 days, and 251 days afterwards, you saw this big spike in births. This is a nice urban myth, but it is a wonderful story, so it sticks around. And so we argued, well, we locked the whole country up in their homes, and so obviously they will make babies. kind of misregarding the idea that we have contraception and that family planning is a bit more complex than just to go, well, honey, let's lie down. We're locked down. That's the only thing I can think of. Turns out we actually did spend much more time watching Netflix than, playing with each other. And so there was no COVID birth spike. It would be a wonderful story, but it isn't. And
In
we
fact, there
saw
were fewer births than in the 5
birth
years
rates
prior.
continue to go down because, as it turns out, you were robbed of the opportunity to meeting new partners, to make new babies
Yes.
more than anything else. And of course, it mostly had to do with confidence. We family members, when we are confident that we can afford it, when we are confident about the future and the COVID years, we must remember how uncertain things were. We had no idea how long this would take, how the recovery would take, how would the economy or not bounce back. So this was tough. It's not the ideal environment to say, let's start a big family.
Makes sense. So fertility dropped, but millennials were still entering their family formation age. We've discussed this in previous podcasts. In fact, if you are new to watching or listening to this, go back to previous podcasts where we've discussed the various demographic groups and how they are going to be handling the future and how they work, how they communicate, how they want to live. And one of the trends now after this lower fertility for a period of time is that millennials are entering their family formation age. So I guess more babies are likely ahead.
Exactly. So we have seen very high birth numbers, even if birth rates drop simply because the cohort whose time it was to make babies during the pandemic years were the millennial generation, the biggest generation by a long shot. So if you ask a midwife to look back at the pandemic years, she will tell you about a very, very busy time in her life. And of course, a time where she worked under really crappy circumstances with, the dads not being allowed into the birth suite and so forth. So she would have
Yes, I forgot about all
she
that.
would have
Terrible.
heaps of horror stories, but it would not be a story of boredom that the midwife will tell you.
What about deaths? Were there more deaths? Did COVID affect Australia? I remember the stories and the terrible images of Europe and America where there were many COVID deaths.
Yes, so we did have COVID deaths. It's of course difficult to count deaths, and we saw in total numbers of deaths, we saw a big spike during the pandemic years. Not all of this spike was due to COVID. We would estimate about 20 to 30,000 excess COVID deaths that would not have occurred had we not had a pandemic.
Well, that's a terrible number if it affects your family.
These are real lives that were cut short. Absolutely correct. And it is much lower than at some point we expected. So you could say that from this health perspective, the lockdowns were worth it, at least in the short term, because we do not know if the negative aspects of the COVID lockdowns would have a long-lasting impact on life expectancy. We're talking about more people, especially poor people, ending up being more disadvantaged, which usually translates into lower life expectancy in the long run. So to actually play out how much this impacted it, we need 60, 70 years into the future to actually kind of measure this. But for now, call it 20 to 30,000 COVID excess deaths. The other deaths that we saw increase was just Australia getting older. And if you get older, on average, you expect more deaths each year.
Well, again, part of your job as a demographer is to see how the trends are going to affect the future with regard to economy, businesses, investing. How does all this then play out, the population changes? How's that going to play out in the future for Australia?
Yeah, so the predictable trend is that we see a continued slowdown of birth rates. So that means natural increase is the surplus of births compared to the number of deaths. The deaths keep slowing down slowly, but surely. We'll have a couple of fewer births added in relative terms each year. We will see deaths increase, even though life expectancy goes up. But we now push this big baby boomer cohort into the oldest baby boomer is 79 years of age at the moment. And so we push them into the 80s in the coming decade, and then things change. But that wasn't nearly as impacted by the pandemic as it could have been. Remember that the pandemic and the COVID virus was very much more likely to kill an elderly person than
Yes.
a younger person. And so this could have been much more severe, the number of deaths, than what it was. So that was a surprisingly good result, if you will. So we have not seen this big drawdown on our life expectancy in this country. The older people are mostly still around. So that is a very good development. So that didn't impact it then, if that makes sense.
With a few more deaths, fewer births, I guess we've become more reliant on immigration in Australia. We've discussed that in previous podcasts. I know it always causes controversy and lots of people leave comments about that because there's positives and negatives to our high immigration levels.
Exactly. So the migration argument is highly debated, but from a purely demographic perspective, you would say we now will rely even more on migration. And this would increase probably even more in about 10 years' time when we see millennials finishing the baby making. And then it's an even smaller cohort adding to the. So we will then see much fewer births in 10 years' time. And what do you do then? Either you find a way to be super productive as an economy, to do away with most of human labor, or you import human labor. And that's migration. So I think in the short term, migration will be the way that Australia chooses to balance its demographic imbalances.
Well, again, I'd like to remind the new listeners and viewers to this that we've discussed this in detail in previous podcasts. So wherever you're watching or listening to this, hey, finish this show first, and why not subscribe so you get Simon and my information every week. But go back and have a look at how that's also going to affect our housing markets and our property markets, because I know a lot of people watching this are interested in property investment. Now, at the beginning of this, I mentioned, Simon, that different life stages, different age groups, different people living in even in different states were affected differently. Maybe you could just walk us through how COVID affected different age groups. It was only 6 years ago. We've all gotten on with our lives, but I think it is worthwhile having a reminder about this.
Yeah, so if you look at the young ones, preschool years and so forth, we saw the cohort actually shrink. So we have fewer under 8-year-olds in the country than we did at the beginning of the pandemic. That's just demographic shifts there. And in a kind of a counterintuitive way, we saw the demand for childcare increase rather than decrease. And that is to do with cost of living going up and therefore more households relying on two incomes and therefore the kids needing to be parked in childcare during the day. So all of a sudden you see the demand for childcare go up, even though the number of kids go down. That is just kind of wonderful in a data set when you find those stories. It's an interesting narrative. But of course, if you deal with childcare centers, they suffer from the skills shortage, from the lack of workers.
Yes.
They did so before the pandemic, and now that the demand surged, they struggle even more. And if you have a kid in childcare, you know that workers change from one center to the next because they can get better employment opportunities, scheduling that works better for them quite easily. So there's a workforce that gets pickier, and they can be pickier in the process as well. The teenage cohort saw growth. So that, of course, then that's again just demographics at play because they were already born before the pandemic. But so we pushed a bigger cohort into the teenage years. That put more pressure under schools who were understaffed to begin with and who, of course, had to deal with a lot of this change. So you all of a sudden need to change the way that you teach and you take kids out of school in their formative years when teenagers are meant to learn from the other moronic teenage friends that they have. And we park them in different bedrooms and we don't let them loose on each other. So there is quite a bit of interpersonal learning that could not take place for these young teenagers. So therefore, I think this cohort must now play catch up in a certain way. So these young people, we must grant them the right to somehow catch up on this learning. And so on a
Yes.
workplace, I could argue maybe you need to do a bit more workplace 101 training with your young workers, because a bit of the socialization that we did have in the past was taken from them. So that's the teenagers. Then you had the people in their 20s. This is the renting stage of the life cycle. This is when you're meant to go out clubbing, when you have the cafe culture. And of course, they work in hospitality, they work in tourism, they work in temporary jobs, and they're meant to travel, they're meant to go out. And COVID very much limited life for them. So we don't really know what this looks like, but we saw, for example, the big and very quick recovery of the nighttime economy, which I would say is linked to that this cohort was very hungry to catch up on this. And of course, we would expect that this cohort now, people that were in their 20s during the pandemic, that they would probably push out first childbirth, partnering up a bit later because they couldn't live through the, this finding your partner phase in the way that they had planned. Then you had the millennials, people that were in their 30s at the beginning of the pandemic. That's me. I was in the 30s. Now I'm not. So this is the family formation stage. So there were heaps of millennials that started making their babies smack bang in the center and at the beginning of the pandemic. So they had COVID babies, and you push this cohort now through the mid 40s. This is the highest spending phase of the life cycle. This big spending of the millennials, the family formation stage, that is inflationary in nature because you buy probably a second car, you buy a pram, you buy all this baby equipment, you buy toys, or there's another person who sooner or later starts eating and adding to the household budget there. So that is inflationary in nature, which again is what we are dealing with now. And then of course, once you skip to the 50s, that is the Gen X cohort. These Gen Xers, they are a small cohort. We discussed them before, and they have high earnings, they have high expenses. They were most likely to have overextended their mortgage during the pandemic years. So they feel financial pressures, but they still have those teenage kids that they look after. And they now increasingly during the pandemic started to look after their elderly parents. So big stress on those guys. And of course, the beloved baby boomers who overwhelmingly went into retirement during the pandemic years. And you could say, well, just dodge that bullet there. Don't need to worry about that. But they feel as a cohort, they feel cheated out
Yes.
of at least 2 years of their golden retirement years, because baby boomers, of course, we're generalizing, and they went through their working lives with the idea, with the understanding that they work their butts off now, and then in retirement, they live it up. That was the kind of like deal that baby boomers had made with themselves. And now we cut their retirement short, in a sense, to a certain degree. And so they are peeved about it. But that, of course, the pandemic turned boomers into an even better consumer cohort because they are rich, they're still relatively healthy and young. The real aging hasn't begun yet. And so they now feel the urge to part with their money, which of course is great if you have a baby boomer in the business and they want to treat themselves, they want to live their best lives. It's like, that's the best customer you can wish for. And so yeah, I think that's how the different cohorts were impacted by the pandemic.
So if I understood what you're saying correctly, the millennials are now, they're the biggest generation group. They're buying homes, they're buying kids' toys, lifestyle goods, they're spending, and so are the baby boomers. I guess there's some of the reasons we've got inflationary pressures, but also skills shortages.
Yeah, definitely. So the high spending of the boomer and the millennial cohorts, that is demographic in nature. They find themselves in high spending phases and circumstances, and that is definitely inflationary. There is more that feeds into the inflation rate, but from a demographic perspective, that was predictable, and that is just a clear thing that's not going away in the next decade. So the millennials and the boomers will continue to spend money because they're in that phase of the life cycle and because they still have money. Millennials don't make more savings happen at scale because they spend all the money. That's fine. But so if you just play forecasting and you want to understand what kind of market circumstances we might be dealing with, I'd say a relatively high inflation, which translates into relatively high interest rates from the demographic perspective, is guaranteed.
Yes, I can understand that. We mentioned the boomers are now, I guess, trying to make up for it with travel, leisure, lifestyle, wellness. We had a previous episode explaining that they're hanging on to their old family homes. They're not moving. Boy, that created a lot of controversy and tons of comments on
Yes.
YouTube where people were saying, hey, I've worked hard all my life. It's not for you young guys to tell us what to do and how to live and what houses to keep. Well, first of all, I'm not a young guy anymore, and I'm a boomer as well, and I've right-sized. But I don't think we were suggesting that they should move out of their big homes. I think, Simon, all you were doing was pointing out a fact of what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And I always say basic truisms about Australia being a free country. You live in whatever way you choose as long as this is legal. That's the end of it from my end. And of course, the downsizing argument is we take the perspective of the market and we say, well, if we wanted to optimize the market, how would you do this? And you would want to encourage right sizing. We will not drag anyone out of their home and plonk them into a smaller home or anything like this. And of course, there is an issue there about intergenerational justice that people get quite emotional about it. And I'm not saying that any generation is better than the other. I think that is a ridiculous assumption, to be quite fair, because we are talking about so many people in that sense. But yeah, baby boomers moving into retirement, of course, had just this effect that they aren't downsizing. And even though we had this narrative about downsizing, people don't want to downsize in Australia. They stay in their home. And all the while, these people stay in their home. They have all the right to do so. And then we push a bigger cohort, the millennials, into the family-sized home stage of the life cycle, and we're not building enough homes. And so, of course, you then look at, well, what could we do with the existing stock? Is there a way how we could better reallocate those houses? We're not allocating them because we're not Stalin. Yeah, we can't say you go from this apartment to that apartment or something like this. That's not what we're doing, thank God. And we just think about market solutions that might actually help or not.
Well, Simon, we spoke about the millennials, we spoke about the baby boomers, but what about the Gen X? They always seem to be forgotten.
Yeah. And
in the middle.
I want to say rightly so now, but they are a smaller cohort, so it is quite easy to just do away with them in a bit of a quick comment. Now, but so the important thing about Gen X is that the banks had a particular focus on them during the pandemic years, because this was the cohort. They weren't the first home buyers. They weren't downsizers. They were the cohort that wanted to upgrade the family home, either through a big renovation or by moving from the 3-bedroom into the 4 or 5-bedroom dwelling to make sure that the stinky teenagers are away. Maybe they wanted to prepare themselves to get an elderly parent into the household, something like this. And so they did this. They had a bit of money saved up because they bought homes relatively early, not as early as boomers, but relatively early. So they had paid off a big chunk of their mortgage. House prices are high and interest rates are low. So it's very tempting in this environment to go, let's upgrade. And what do? Yeah, you upgrade, you probably overextend or go to the absolute limit, and then those darn interest rates keep rising. And so you feel the pressure. And so the banks looked at those guys and were like, boy, if anyone is defaulting on their mortgage, it's probably those guys. And so it turns out we didn't have mortgage defaults in Australia. Some, of course, but not, there wasn't any kind of surge worth speaking of. And that's because Australians still managed somehow to work around it. Yeah.
And well, banks lowered interest rates. They gave mortgage holidays. They didn't say you don't have to pay, but they let you have a break if you didn't have a job and then have to catch up. Simon, I remember those days because having a property advisory business, we manage close to $2 billion worth of investments on behalf of clients around Australia. I was worried what would happen with property management and inspections, but the world actually kept going on. And interestingly, one of our divisions is a buyer's agency where we help people buy their homes or their investment properties. And it just kept going on after the initial challenges. People worked around it with virtual inspections. Our team were still able to get into certain properties under the various conditions. And so, in fact, business-wise, to be blunt, there were a number of very good years. For those who don't know, what our team at Metropole do is help our clients safely grow, protect, and pass on their wealth to future generations, something we talk about in this podcast, but we do it by giving strategic property and wealth advice. So if you're interested in taking advantage of our housing markets, this new super cycle that's going to continue on for all the reasons that we've discussed in previous shows, I'll leave a link in the show notes. Go to Metropole. While I gave a shameless plug for our services, Simon, maybe you can explain a little bit about what you do and how you help your clients.
Demographics Group only looks at demographic and other big picture data, then tries to figure out what the world looks like through the demographic perspective. And so when we work with a local government area, we try to explain how this area is changing demographically. When we talk to a specific industry or business, we try to tell them what their business looks like from the demographic perspective. Because self-serving narrative, we argue, of course, that you're better off if you understand the demographic perspective, because it is the most predictable part of forecasting. You can all try to predict interest rates and stock market cycles and so forth, and the geopolitical developments that impact how you're operating your business. But demographics is the most stable one. And so if you get this part right, you have more stability in your business in the future. So that's what we do.
Well, I'll leave a link to the demographics group in the show notes and how people can get onto you to talk about helping their businesses, their organizations, their institutions, because in my mind, with regard to property, demographics is going to be a much bigger trend and affect how and where people are going to want to live than the ups and downs of interest rates or the various tax changes. So let's just put all this together, Simon. If you step back, what are the lasting legacies of COVID for Australia's demographics and for our economy?
Yes, I'd say more than anything, COVID sped up trends rather than created new trends. So if you look at the consumption cycle, if you look at people making or not making babies, lowering birth rates, we haven't even talked about the idea that what happened during the pandemic years is people moving from the inner city to the urban fringe.
Of course.
Part of
Oh, to
this
regional Australia.
Exactly, or to regional Australia, because part of this was pandemic induced. That's the idea that you can work remotely. And so why would you pay a premium to live close to the office tower if you're not going to the office tower? And so people moved to the fringe, to regional Australia, where rents or property was cheaper. That made sense. But this trend would have occurred even without the COVID, because what we still would have seen is the millennials who cluster in the inner suburbs as couples and singles at the moment. They add their 1.5 babies to the households, and then they need to find a family-sized dwelling. And these family-sized dwellings aren't available in the inner suburbs. So you need to move to those dwellings. And those dwellings, well, they exist in the middle suburbs, but we discussed the baby boomers before. They are still there hogging the 3 and 4 bedroom stock in the middle suburbs as empty nesters. They're not downsizing. They were great NIMBYs. They blocked development there pretty well. So millennials have to go to the urban fringe, and that continues for the next 10 years. So that's another trend that was sped up by the pandemic. We did, of course, see fewer babies, more deaths. Ultimately, yes, migration more or less stable in the long-term average. But overall, the age profile of Australia slowly ticks upwards. We get a bit older bit by bit. We saw this high consumption cycle during the pandemic years, meaning you have millennials in the highest spending phase of the life cycle. Boomers are the richest generation. They still happily spend. The skills shortage that wasn't made better by the pandemic. We still run out of workers. One of the big topics that we discuss here all the time is, of course, the skills shortage, retiring a baby boomer cohort, taking in a smaller cohort, sending the millennials on parental leave in the meantime for the next decade, and of course parking our young people for a very long time on campus where they take on more educational qualifications, and then they are only contributing to the workforce later in life. All this leads to a contracted worker pool that businesses can draw from. That was emphasized during the pandemic. So all this feeds into what we would call sticky inflation, which I would argue leads to higher rather than lower interest rates in the long term. And that's part of our pandemic legacy.
Interesting. So there we are, 6 years on. COVID didn't give us a new future, but it sure hurried us into the one we were heading into. Australians are now older, more dependent on migration, and shaped by the push-pull between boomers stepping back and millennials stepping up. So for business owners and investors, from what Simon's just explained to me, the lesson's clear. Watch these demographic currents. They explain why labour is tight, why spending patterns are shifting, and why some industries will thrive while others will struggle. So each week, Simon and I are going to get together to explain the demographic trends shaping your futures. So if you don't currently subscribe to this, follow or subscribe, whatever it says on the podcast app or YouTube you're watching this. And please do me and Simon a favour. The only thing we ask of you, just tell one person about Demographics Decoded so that we can get our message out to more and more people. Simon, as always, thanks for bringing all these numbers to life.
Great pleasure.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.